Hello, my name is Diane, and today I want to talk about my most disappointing reads of 2023. These are the books that I liked the least. The worst books I read this year, I guess, but I don't really like to think of them as the worst books because I don't necessarily think they were bad books. They just weren't for me. They weren't what I expected when I went into them, or something about the style just didn't work for me. But I went into them expecting to like them and was disappointed to find that I didn't like them nearly as much as I hoped that I would. But anyway, here are the books that I was most disappointed by that I read in 2023. The first book is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is the first book in the Wayfarer series, and it follows a crew that lives on a spaceship. They make wormhole tunnels or something like that. I don't know, it's very cozy sci-fi. It seems to be very well loved in the cozy sci-fi community, but that's just not, it just wasn't for me. It felt too familiar, the things that happened. I don't feel like they felt cohesive as a full book, and I didn't feel like I cared about any of the characters enough. They just weren't distinct enough from other sci-fi works that I know. And that made this feel like fan fiction where the stakes weren't high enough and the characters weren't unique enough from other sci-fi works that I'm familiar with. So for me, it all just felt a little too familiar, and while not having the high stakes to make me more invested, I just felt like I was spending time with characters that I already knew, and that's not really what I wanted when I went into this. Next up, I have The London Seance Society by Sarah Penner. This book follows a girl who goes to investigate the death of her sister, and she's working with a psychic, and they end up going to investigate another murder through the London Seance Society, which is a group of men who perform seances. And I liked half of the story. I liked following the sister, and I thought that was interesting, her trying to figure out what happened to her sister. But the other half of the story follows one of the men in the society, and I just didn't really care about his half of the story. I never really connected with it. I didn't really care about what he was adding to the story. So it's kind of hard to love a book when you only like half of what's going on. I only liked that one perspective, and I wasn't expecting one of the men to be the other perspective. I was actually expecting it to be the woman that she was working with, which I guess would have given you less perspective on the story because they were together for the majority of it. So it made sense to have that other perspective. It's just not what I was anticipating going into it, and I just didn't really connect with him very much. And that unfortunately took away my enjoyment from this. I still may read more Sarah Penner in the future because I loved The Lost Apothecary. This one just didn't live up to the level of how much I enjoyed her first book. Finlay Donovan Jumps the Gun by Elko Samano. This is the third book in the Finlay Donovan series. This was similar to the last book. I liked the other two books a lot more than I liked this one, which is what made it disappointing. I went into it with an expectation that it was going to captivate me as much as the first book or the second book did in this series, and it just didn't quite live up to that. I didn't get that level of enjoyment. I liked this one. I thought it was fine. I just didn't think it was as good as the other books, and that's what made it so disappointing for me. Finlay Donovan is an author who, being overheard one day, is mistaken as a contract killer, and she is hired to kill someone. That's obviously not what she does for a living. She's just an author, but she's also a single mother who's struggling with cash right now. So the offer of what this woman wants to pay her is very tempting, even though she doesn't know the first thing about how to kill someone. She gets wrapped up in this life of crime in an unexpected way. I think it's very funny. It's a very ridiculous situation to be in. The first book was a lot of fun. The second book was also a lot of fun. And this book was a little bit less fun for me personally. Just didn't grip me in quite the same way. Lies We Sing to the Sea by Sarah Underwood. This one, unfortunately, I just think was not marketed as what it was, at least the marketing that I saw. I don't really learn too much about books before I go into them because I don't like having specific expectations. I like just knowing the general idea, but this one I had understood was an Odyssey retelling, and I don't think that that's accurate. It is inspired by a particular scene in the Odyssey, but it is not a retelling of the Odyssey. It also reads a lot younger than I thought that it was going to for some reason. I think that was just a mistake on my part, but the actual plot of the story wasn't what I expected, hearing it being an Odyssey retelling. But it follows a girl who is sacrificed as one of 12 maidens that are hung every year to keep this island safe. And instead she wakes up on an island with this other woman and is trained to try and put a stop to this curse. They think that they have a way to stop it. And I just didn't feel like the plot was moving along as well as I wanted it to. I think there was a big focus on this love triangle that I don't think made any sense. The attraction between either of the pairings, just developing that wasn't really there for me. And I don't know, a lot of this is just personal taste. The story I thought I was going into was not the story that this actually is. So I think there's definitely an audience for this. I just am definitely not it. Ascension by Nicholas Binge. This follows a man who there's a mysterious mountain that appears in the sea one day, and he is put on the team to go investigate it. It's a small team of scientists, and it's told through letters that he wrote to his niece surrounding the mystery of this mountain and what happened while he was ascending it. The setup of the story I thought was so good. The brother of this man finds out unexpectedly that his brother is still alive. He's been assumed to have been dead for many years at this point, and he finds out that he's actually living somewhere. Someone he knows saw him and told him about it, and he finds that he is still alive, and then you're discovering what happened to him in the time that he was missing. And that's all very interesting, but as we learn more about the mountain and as he is getting closer to the summit of this mountain with his team, it just got kind of weird and not in a way that was doing anything for me. What happens at the top, again, felt like something that I had seen before in sci-fi, and that to me is just makes a book much less interesting to me when there's something that feels like I've already seen it before. I know there are so many stories out there that there's going to be similarities across all of them, but I like for there to be some unique twist or the way that it plays into the story. But when the big reveal or the point of the story feels too familiar, it just really loses me. And that's sort of what happened with this. So I think there's definitely something really interesting here. It's just the way that what the story was building up to wasn't something that I found very engaging or exciting. Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. This is the first Fonda Lee story that I've read. It follows a character whose family is killed by some very large creature, and she sets out to join it's like the king's army. They fly, I think they're called rooks, and they hunt these manicores. I think they were manicores. So that makes that her life mission to join this army and hunt these creatures that killed her family. It's a story of kind of an obsessive vengeance, and I think the premise is interesting. I didn't like the main character, which is a big thing for me. I didn't like the main character, so I didn't really care about what happened to her. I was also very disappointed at the ending. I'm not going to spoil it, but there's the potential that something really bad is going to happen to someone and it doesn't. Something else happens instead, and I feel like that's a terrible thing to say, that I wanted the really bad thing to happen, but I did. I thought it would have been much more impactful for the way that I was interpreting the story anyway, and it just didn't, and I already didn't care about the main character, so then being disappointed in the ending just made the story overall very disappointing for me. Witch King by Martha Wells. I liked this story in the end, but the disappointing part of this story for me is that it took quite a bit to get into it for everything to feel like it was falling into place and making sense. We follow a demon who awakes in a trap and someone has like captured him and is trying to take over his magic, but he wakes up during that process and he has to figure out what happened and how he got there with the help of a few of his friends. He's not really sure who he can trust because he doesn't know who put him in that trap. And we alternate between what's currently happening and then the past leading up to what happened to him. And I liked once we finally got into things, the world just was very strange and nothing at all was explained. So you just have to figure it out as you go, which I generally don't mind, but sometimes there's too much unfamiliarity and I'm not really sure where we are or who anybody is. And that's how it felt at the start of this book, where I wasn't really sure who or what I should care about. And then as things progressed, I definitely got more invested in it, figuring out who some of these people were. And I liked the way that the past and present paralleled one another as we got further into it. But it unfortunately just took too long for me to really feel invested in the story, and that's the disappointing part of this book, even though in the end I ultimately ended up liking it. The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekhara. This follows a character who was raised to kill his father. He was raised and trained with the purpose of him eventually killing his father. So he has a very dark past. He's kind of messed up about it, but he has moved to this city and he's starting a new life there and getting his footing there. And throughout this city, there are these mysterious bright doors, which are portals. Nobody really knows what they do or where they go. So you're just kind of exploring the city with him. I think it's a really cool concept. I think there are a lot of really cool things in this. I think it's just not really a subgenre for me. There's a very specific type of urban fantasy that I like, and this does not fall into that niche category. So while there were some interesting things going on, I feel like the story just didn't stick with me after I finished it. I thought it was just very forgettable for me because I didn't connect that much with the writing style and the main character and seeing him try and solve this mystery of the doors and what's going on in this city. But I would definitely be interested in reading something else from this author if he comes out with something new. This just wasn't the type of story that I tend to enjoy, and unfortunately that was also true for this specific book. The Shadow of Perseus by Claire Haywood. This is a Greek myth retelling about Perseus, following three women whose lives he was a major part of for very different reasons. I'm not very into, I've learned this year, Greek myth retellings. I've never loved Greek mythology specifically. I like mythology, I like folklore, but Greek myths for some reason just aren't very intriguing to me, and while there are quite a few Greek myth retellings, I try them here and there and they just usually don't work for me. So I think I'm just very biased about this book. But I also feel like even though we're following the three main female characters and how this man affected their lives, I don't feel like the women had enough agency in telling their story, like their version of events. I don't feel like there was enough of them in them, if that makes sense. I don't know how better to describe that. I feel like they're just recounting the events as they were in the male side of the story, but just slightly different. I don't feel like their version of the events was as different or impactful enough for me to care about them, for me to be as moved by their version as I feel like I should have been. I don't know, as a story about three females and their lives, I feel like this was still mostly just about the guy. In a way it was, just not, I don't know, it wasn't what I wanted it to be, but it's also a Greek myth retelling, so maybe it never would have been what I wanted it to be because it's still a Greek myth, and I just don't care about this that much. And the last book is Breaking Day by Adam Oyebanji. This book I liked the premise of a lot. I just think it read a little too young for me. I don't think it reads super young, but it read younger than I wanted it to. I thought it would be a bit darker and more suspenseful. It follows an engineer in training who lives on a spaceship, and they are on their way to their destination where they're going to land and form a civilization, I think is their goal. But when they're almost at their destination, he looks out the window one day and sees a girl out in space without a spacesuit. She's very much alive. He has no idea who she is. There's nobody else around. to see this, but also outside of their spaceship, there's no one with them. So there's this whole mystery of, was he hallucinating, or if she was real, where did she come from? How was she out there without a suit on? And it felt like it took too long to really delve into that mystery. Seemed like it kind of happened. The pieces of that mystery building up were too spaced out in the first half of the story for me, that I wasn't super intrigued to keep going, because it felt like there was a lot between one instance of seeing her and then the next instance of something strange and mysterious happening, that by the time things kicked off, I just wasn't super invested as the mystery built and we started getting answers and figuring out what was happening. I wasn't super invested in what was going on anymore. So I liked the overall idea of the story. It's just the way that it was paced out didn't work for me. And that's that. Those are the 10 books that I was most disappointed by this year. They weren't what I thought they were going to be going into it, or some of them they were, they just weren't for me. Let me know if you've read any of these, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I'd be interested to hear about it. That's all for me today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. Bye.